Nobody warned me that working for him would feel like standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. I'd been his housekeeper for 4 months before I understood what that silence actually meant. The particular kind of quiet that fell over a room the second Seung-min walked into it. Not the quiet of respect, though there was plenty of that too. Something older, more instinctive. The kind of stillness that happened when every person in a space registered, on some animal level, that they were no longer the most dangerous thing in it. That morning had started like any other. I was on my knees in the east hallway of the Hanover estate, his primary Chicago residence, not the Evanston house or the place downtown that nobody talked about, scrubbing a water stain from the marble floor that one of the evening staff had failed to report. My back ached from the angle. My knees were going to bruise. I had a philosophy podcast in one earbud, and the distant sound of the city outside in the other, the low morning groan of Lakeshore Drive traffic filtering through the tall arched windows above me. I was thinking about dinner. Specifically whether I'd remembered to take the chicken out of the freezer in my apartment. I wouldn't have. I never did. When the footsteps came. Not Seung-min's. I knew his footsteps by then. Everyone who worked in that house did. His were almost soundless, unhurried, precise. These were heavier, deliberate in a way that felt performative, like the person making them wanted to be heard. I pulled out my earbud and looked up. There were 2 of them. Men I didn't recognize, which meant they weren't regular staff. They wore dark slacks and open-collar shirts, and the specific kind of studied casualness that men put on when they're trying very hard not to look like what they are. One was broad-shouldered, maybe mid-30s, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. The other was younger, thinner, with a phone in his hand that he wasn't actually looking at. You. The broader one stopped in front of me. I didn't stand up immediately, which I think surprised him. I'm sorry? You're the maid. It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer it as one. I sat back on my heels and looked at him steadily, which I'd learned to do from months of working in spaces where showing uncertainty was its own kind of mistake. I'm the household manager. Can I help you with something? He looked me over in a way that made my skin feel wrong. Slow, deliberate, like he was pricing something. Household manager. He said it the way people say things they find funny without smiling. Sure, Mr. Seung-min's expecting us in the East study. Point us there. Mr. Kang's schedule doesn't include, just point us there, sweetheart. That word landed on me like a hand I hadn't consented to. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. 4 months in this house had taught me a lot of things, and one of them was that I was not supposed to make scenes, redirect guests by force, or handle situations that weren't mine to handle. Another thing it had taught me was that the East study was one of the 3 rooms in this house where Seung-min went when he did not want to be found, which meant that whatever these men were to him, they weren't the kind of guests he'd be welcoming before 9 in the morning. I stood up slowly, peeling off the rubber glove from my right hand. I'll let Mr. Kang know you're here, if you'd like to wait in the front. The broader man stepped forward. Not aggressively, exactly, but enough. His shadow crossed over me, and I took one involuntary step back before I caught myself, and I hated that step, hated the way it had come out of my body without my permission. We don't need an announcement, he said. In this house, everyone does. My voice was even. I was proud of that. I'll be right back. I turned and walked. Did not hurry, did not run, toward the back corridor that led to the staff stairwell. Behind me, I heard one of them exhale through his nose, dismissive and bored. I kept my shoulders straight until I turned the corner, and then I let myself breathe. My heart was going faster than it should have been. That annoyed me. I pressed my palm flat against the cool plaster wall for exactly 3 seconds, the way my grandmother used to tell me to do when things felt bigger than my body could hold, and then I climbed the stairs. Seung-min was not in the East study. He was in the kitchen. This happened sometimes, more often than I'd expected, honestly. from a man who had an entire staff for the specific purpose of making sure he never had to do anything for himself. He'd be standing at the counter with a cup of coffee he'd made himself, reading something on his phone, or occasionally just staring out the window at the back garden with an expression I had never once been able to read. He was intensely private in a way that felt almost physical, like privacy was something he wore on his body. He was wearing a black dress shirt, no jacket yet, the collar open. The tattoos that covered his neck and chest were visible above the neckline, and I'd stopped noticing them the way I'd stopped noticing the marble floors and the art on the walls. They were just part of him, intricate and dark, and somehow perfectly consistent with the rest of his presence. He glanced up when I came in. He did that, looked at you directly, immediately, without the half-second delay most people had, the one where they were still finishing a thought before they acknowledged you. His attention was total and immediate, and every single time, it did something to my nervous system that I was still pretending was just professional unease. "There are 2 men in the east hallway," I said. "They say you're expecting them." He set down his coffee cup. Not quickly. He moved the way he always moved, without urgency, like he had personally negotiated with time, and time had agreed to slow down for him. "What did they look like?" I described them. He listened with his eyes on my face, which made it difficult to concentrate on the description, but I got through it. "Did they touch anything?" "No." A pause, small and precise. "Did they touch you?" I thought about the way that man's shadow had crossed over me, the step I'd taken back. "No," I said. Seungmin looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. There was something behind his eyes that I couldn't read, which was true of most things about him. But this felt different, sharper, more specific. "Go finish what you were doing," he said quietly. "Use the west corridor." "Okay." I turned to leave. "Ava." My name in his voice still did something I wasn't prepared for every single time. He said it without inflection, almost flat, but it had weight to it, like the word mattered to him even when he was being careful not to show it. I turned back. "You said no." I waited. "You hesitated first," he said. And then he picked up his coffee cup again and looked back at his phone, and the conversation was over. I stood there for exactly 1 second too long before I left. The west corridor took me around the back of the east wing. I could hear voices from somewhere ahead. Low, male, the specific register of men performing the illusion of patience. And then Seungmin's voice, cutting through without being raised, and silence again, the kind that followed something final. I didn't stop walking. I went back to the east hallway and knelt down next to my bucket, and put my glove back on and pressed my cloth to the marble, and told myself, very firmly, that I was not going to think about the way he'd said my name, or the fact that he'd noticed the hesitation I'd barely noticed myself. I scrubbed until the stain was gone. It was 11 minutes before I heard the front door close and understood that the 2 men had left. I didn't see Seungmin again until the afternoon. But twice that day, the security guard who covered the east wing, a quiet man named Daeho, who'd worked for Seungmin for 6 years and said almost nothing to anyone, walked past me in the hallway and nodded, which he had never done before. I filed that away in the part of my mind where I kept things I didn't yet have language for. The thing about working inside a world you don't fully understand is that you develop a different kind of attention. You stop looking for the obvious things, the raised voices, the visible threats, the dramatic moments that announce themselves. You start reading the smaller stuff instead. The way a room empties before it empties, people drifting toward exits before anything has actually happened. The particular quality of a phone call that ends too quickly. The way someone's eyes move when they're calculating something they don't want you to see them calculating. 4 months in Seungmin's house had turned me into a person I almost didn't recognize sometimes. More careful, more quiet, more aware of the space between what was said and what was meant. I told myself it was just professional instinct. The job demanded it. I was getting better at lying to myself. 3 days after the incident with the 2 men, Nothing had been said about it. Not by Seungmin, not by any of the staff, not by Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper who'd hired me, and who communicated primarily through laminated checklists and the occasional tight-lipped nod of approval. Life in the estate continued with its usual structured rhythm. Morning cleaning rotations, afternoon maintenance, the quiet coordination of a household that ran like a system designed to never show its own machinery. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the weight of that moment. Then I came back from my grocery run on a Thursday afternoon and found a different car parked in the service entrance lot. This wasn't unusual on its own. There were always cars, deliveries, contractors, the rotating roster of men who arrived and left without being introduced, and who the staff treated with a specific kind of careful non-acknowledgement. But this one I recognized. A dark gray sedan, with a small dent in the rear panel. The kind of dent that looked recent, that looked like it had been made in a hurry. It was the same car that had been parked outside when those two men visited. I stood in the lot with my reusable bags and looked at it for longer than I should have. Then I went inside. The estate felt different. Not louder, never louder. Seungmin ran a house where volume was considered a form of carelessness, but tighter somehow. The two staff members I passed in the back corridor moved with slightly too much purpose, the way people do when they've been told to stay out of a specific part of the building, without being told exactly why. I found Mrs. Park in the linen storage room, cataloging tablecloths with the specific focused energy she used when she was pointedly not looking up. "The West Wing sitting room needs to be cleared by 4, she said before I'd asked anything. "Mr. Kang has a meeting." "Is there anything specific they'll—" "By 4, Ava." I cleared the room by 3:45. Straightened the chairs, removed the extra decorative objects that Seungmin disliked having on surfaces when he was working, set out the simple tray that Mrs. Park had prepared. Water, nothing else. He didn't offer guests comfort items during certain kinds of meetings. I'd learned that early. I was gathering the last of the displaced objects when I heard the voices coming down the hall. I moved toward the service door on the far side of the room, the one that connected to the back passage. The natural thing was to be gone before the meeting began. Staff wasn't present for these. We existed around them, before and after, but never during. I was 3 steps from the door when it opened from the other side. A man I had never seen stepped through it, and he stopped when he saw me. And the way he stopped told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man he was. He was older than Seungmin, late 40s maybe, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from discipline, but from having done enough things that nothing surprised him anymore. He was well-dressed. He looked at me the way the man in the hallway had looked at me 3 days ago. That slow inventory. Except this version had something more deliberate behind it. Something that recognized I was inside a space where he could do whatever he wanted, and understood that to be an ordinary fact of life. "Well," he said, in English without an accent, "you must be the household manager." My grip tightened on the framed photograph in my hands. I was just finishing. "Were you?" He didn't move away from the doorway. He didn't need to block it physically. His presence was the block. The specific gravity of a man who was used to people waiting for his permission to move. "I've heard about you." That stopped me in a way I hadn't wanted it to. "I'm sorry." Seungmin's staff. He tilted his head slightly, that inventory look going slower. He keeps a small household, careful with who he lets inside. "I should let you." "Ava, isn't it?" My name in his mouth felt like fingers on my wrist, like something I hadn't offered being taken anyway. I didn't answer that. I looked at the door behind him, calculated the distance, measured whether I could get past him without it becoming something. And in that half-second of calculation, I felt my own body the way you feel it in moments of threat. Too visible, too specific, too much like a thing that could be handled. "Excuse me," I said, and I moved. He didn't block me, but his hand came out as I passed, and his fingers closed briefly around my forearm. Not roughly, which almost made it worse. It was the ease of it that was horrifying, the casual assumption. And I stopped walking because stopping felt safer than pulling away and escalating something in a room I was alone in. "Tell Seungmin I'm looking forward to the conversation," he said, and released me. I walked through the service door and closed it behind me and stood in the narrow passage with my back against the wall and my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't go to Seungmin. That was the rule I'd set for myself. The line I maintained to keep the job feeling like a job and not like something else. I didn't go to him with personal things, didn't put myself in the category of person who needed managing. I handled things myself, or I brought them to Mrs. Park. I did not manufacture reasons to be in his space. I set the photograph down on the passage shelf, carefully, because I was holding it too tightly, and I didn't want to break anything. Then I walked to the service kitchen and ran cold water over my forearm, which was objectively unnecessary but felt necessary, and I stood there until my breathing was even. 20 minutes later, I was in the far end of the east wing changing out the window treatments when I heard it. I didn't hear the words. The walls in this house were good. Thick plaster, old construction, the kind that absorbed sound intentionally. What I heard was the shape of the conversation. The specific silence that came when Seungmin spoke. The kind of silence that meant whoever was in the room with him had decided to listen very carefully. And then something else, briefer, a question, and then Seungmin's voice again, quiet and absolutely final. And then nothing for a long moment. And then footsteps in the main hall, unhurried ones, leaving. I kept my attention on the window treatment. The fabric was a heavy charcoal linen, and I focused on the way it caught the late afternoon light, the tiny variations in the weave, the brass rings at the top. It was Daeho who found me 20 minutes later. "Mr. Kang would like to see you in the study," he said. He said it the same way he said everything. Factual, no interpretation offered. I nodded and followed him. Seungmin was standing by the window when I came in, looking out at the garden. The meeting was clearly over. The room had its usual quality of deliberate order, nothing out of place, no evidence of whatever conversation had just happened. He didn't turn around immediately. This was also something I'd noticed about him. He didn't perform alertness, didn't do the thing people do when they hear someone enter and make a point of showing they've noticed. He turned around when he was ready, and when he did, his eyes came to me directly and stayed. "Did he touch you?" 2 seconds of something moved through me that I didn't have a word for. I thought about calibrating my answer, about being measured, professional, keeping the boundary I'd set for myself. "My arm," I said. Briefly. It wasn't... I know what it was. His voice hadn't changed in volume or tone. That was the thing that made it hit harder. No anger in the way anger usually presented itself. No heat, no edge. Just absolute certainty. It won't happen again. I looked at him. "What did you..." "It won't happen again, Ava." There was something in the way he said it the second time. My name placed at the end like a period, like a door closing gently but with complete finality, that made further questions feel not just unnecessary but somehow beside the point. I nodded. He turned back to the window. "You can go," he said quietly. I went, and outside in the hallway I stood for a moment and realized, slowly and with a feeling I wasn't prepared for, that I believed him completely. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because of fear, exactly. Or not only that. It was something more complicated, less clean than fear, the kind of thing that sits in your chest and refuses to be categorized. I lay in my apartment 3 miles from the estate and stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment in the service passage with a precision I hadn't asked for. The ease of that man's hand. The specific texture of certainty in Seungmin's voice when he said it won't happen again. The way I'd believed him without asking a single follow-up question, which was either the most rational thing I'd done in months or the most dangerous. I couldn't decide which. My apartment was small and honest. A 1-bedroom in Pilsen, with exposed brick on the north wall, and a radiator that made noise in the night, like it was working through something personally. I'd moved to Chicago 2 years ago for a job that had dissolved 3 months in, and I'd rebuilt quietly, methodically, the way I rebuilt everything. Housekeeping had been temporary at first, a bridge between what I'd planned and whatever came next. 4 months into the Kang estate, I still hadn't figured out what came next, and somewhere along the way, I'd stopped looking quite as hard. I told myself that was practical. The job paid well, the work was clear. I was very good at telling myself things. By 6 a.m, I gave up on sleeping and made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with my hands wrapped around the mug and tried to have an honest conversation with myself, the kind I usually avoided. The kind that required admitting that what unsettled me most about last night wasn't the man who'd grabbed my arm. It was the fact that Seungmin had known before I finished telling him, that he'd said I know what it was with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided on a response before the information was fully in. That should have frightened me more than it did. The next morning at the estate was surface-level normal. I moved through my rotation. East wing, main hall, the formal dining room that was rarely used but required constant maintenance. And the house had its usual contained quality. Everything in its place, the staff moving through their tasks with the professional silence that Seungmin's household ran on. But there were 2 new faces in the security rotation. I noticed because I noticed everything, which was a habit I'd developed here and couldn't seem to turn off. They were stationed at the points that covered the service entrance and the east hallway, the same hallway where the 2 men had appeared 3 days ago. They nodded to the existing staff with the ease of people who'd been briefed, not introduced. They were simply there, woven into the morning like they'd always been. I thought about mentioning it to Mrs. Park, and then didn't. At 11, I was in the formal dining room working on the high windows when I heard Seungmin in the hall. I identified him by the sound before I turned, that particular nearly absent footfall, the way the air in a space shifted slightly when he moved through it, which I understood was probably my imagination, but felt absolutely real. He stopped in the doorway. I was on the 2nd step of the folding ladder, reaching for the upper pane with a microfiber cloth. I looked back at him over my shoulder and felt the usual thing happen. The slight recalibration of my nervous system, the way my body registered his presence before my mind caught up and added context. "The Martins are coming Friday," he said. A pause. "Dinner. 12 people. I'll coordinate with Mrs. Park on the setup. I want you coordinating directly, not through her." This was new. I came down off the ladder step carefully and turned to face him. "Okay. Do you have specific preferences for—" "The same preferences I always have." He looked at me steadily. "You know them." And I did. 4 months had taught me more about this man's specific preferences than I'd learned about most people I'd known for years. He didn't like excess on tables. Floral arrangements were kept low. Candles were used but not accumulated. He preferred the dining room slightly cooler than most guests found comfortable, because he ran warm and wouldn't adjust the room for himself in the middle of a dinner. He drank water through meals, not wine, but the wine had to be right, because the absence of the right wine registered to his guests as carelessness, and he did not permit carelessness. He noticed everything. He commented on nothing unless something was wrong. "I'll take care of it," I said. He nodded once. Didn't move immediately, which was slightly unusual. Seungmin was not a man who lingered in rooms without purpose, who stayed in spaces past the point his business there was finished. "The arm," he said. I went still. "If anything else happens, anyone here, anyone outside, you tell me directly." I held his gaze. I appreciate that. But I can manage. I know you can manage." He said it without inflection, and somehow that was what made it land so squarely. The fact that he wasn't dismissing my capability at all. "I'm not asking because I think you can't. I'm telling you the protocol." Protocol. The word was careful. It placed what he was saying inside the structure of the job, gave it edges, made it professional and bounded and clear. I should have been relieved by that framing. "Okay," I said. He left. I stood in the dining room for a long moment after, the microfiber cloth still in my hand, and I thought about the word protocol and how precisely chosen it had been, and whether precision in word choice was a form of distance or a form of something else entirely. I went back to the windows. Friday arrived with the specific pressure of a household preparing to perform itself. I coordinated directly with the kitchen staff, the florist delivery, the 2 extra servers brought in for the evening. I moved through the estate with my clipboard and my checklist and the focused competence that I used the way other people used armor. Mrs. Park observed from a professional distance and said nothing critical, which from her was close to a standing ovation. The guests arrived at 7. I was in the butler's pantry running final checks when they came through. Voices. The specific social register of wealthy people in a formal setting, comfortable and polished and slightly performative. I caught glimpses through the pass-through. A woman in deep burgundy with a laugh that carried. 2 men in conversation who moved the way men move when they're used to being listened to. And Seung-min among them, in a dark suit, looking precisely like what he was in this context. Young, composed, effortlessly in command of the room in a way that required no effort at all. The guests oriented toward him, subtle gravitational pull, the way people do around someone whose attention feels like a resource worth positioning for. I watched for exactly 4 seconds longer than I needed to. Then I went back to my checklist. The dinner ran cleanly for 2 hours. It was during the transition between courses that I went through the main hallway to check on something in the coat room, and I found a man standing near the entrance who I didn't recognize. Not a guest. He wasn't dressed for a dinner. He was standing too still, the specific stillness of someone who is waiting rather than arriving. And when he saw me, his eyes moved over me with that inventory quality, and I felt my stomach tighten on instinct before I'd consciously registered why. "Can I help you?" I kept my voice even and professional. "I'm with Yoon's group," he said. "I'll wait here. I'm not aware of additional guests expected this evening. I'm not a guest." He smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere. "Just tell Seung-min that Marco's outside. He'll know." I looked at him for one steady moment. "I'll pass that along." I walked back toward the dining room. My pulse was doing something I didn't care for. I caught Daeho near the service entrance, relayed the message in a murmur, and watched his expression, which was professionally controlled, but not controlled enough to hide the very specific kind of alert that moved through it. He nodded once and moved immediately. I went back to my station. 12 minutes later, during the dessert course, Seung-min excused himself from the table. I heard it from the pantry. A brief, gracious departure. A host who'd be back momentarily. The kind of exit that guests accepted without question because everything about him made you accept things without question. He didn't come back for 22 minutes. When he returned, the dinner continued without a visible seam. He sat back down and said something to the woman on his left that made her laugh, and the table reoriented around him as smoothly as if he'd never left. And I stood in the pantry and understood that this was what he was. Not just powerful, but seamless. A man who could step out of a room to handle something I didn't want to imagine, and step back in and pour wine like none of it had weight. The guests left at 10:30. By 11, the staff was clearing, and I was in the dining room collecting the low centerpiece arrangements, and Seung-min walked in. He still had his jacket on. He looked exactly the same as he had at 7, which should have been unremarkable, and wasn't. He stood by the table and watched me work for a moment. Not in the uncomfortable way. Not the way of the men who'd made my skin feel wrong. Something else. Something more like the way a person looks at a thing they've been thinking about. "The dinner was well done," he said. "Thank you." A pause. He reached out and straightened a candle holder that was already straight. A small, absent gesture. I filed it away in the part of my mind where I kept things I didn't have language for, which was getting crowded lately. "Marco," I said, before I'd fully decided to. The man at the entrance. "Was everything handled?" I nodded, kept working. "You were calm," he said. "When you found him." I looked up. I wasn't, particularly. Something moved in his expression. The smallest shift, almost nothing, the kind of thing you only caught if you'd been paying close attention for months and had learned, slowly, what almost nothing looked like on his face. "No," he said quietly, "but you looked it." He left before I could decide what to do with that, and I stood in the dining room with a centerpiece in my hands and the distinct, uncomfortable feeling of being known by someone who had no business knowing me that well. The week after the dinner, I started noticing the car. Not the gray sedan. That one hadn't come back, and I'd stopped tensing every time I pulled into the service lot, which felt like progress. This was different. A black SUV, newer, parked on the street half a block down from the estate's main entrance. It was there Tuesday morning when I arrived, still there at lunch. Gone by the time I left at 6, but back Wednesday, same spot, slightly different angle. I didn't mention it to anyone. This was partly because I wasn't certain I wasn't imagining significance where there was none. Streets had parked cars. That was the nature of streets, and partly because mentioning it would have required going to Seungmin directly, per the protocol he'd established, and I was managing a complicated internal negotiation about that protocol that I hadn't yet resolved. The negotiation went roughly like this. He had offered me a direct line for my safety, which was a reasonable thing for an employer to offer. Accepting it was practical and professionally appropriate. The reason I hadn't was that I'd noticed, with the specificity of someone who had been paying too much attention for too long, that the way he said my name when something was wrong was different from the way he said it otherwise, and I was not prepared to examine what that difference meant to me. So I watched the car and said nothing. Thursday it was gone. Friday. I came in to find that my cleaning rotation had been adjusted without notice, routing me away from the main entrance and the west-facing rooms entirely. When I asked Mrs. Park about it, she looked at me with her usual expression of a person who has been told exactly as much as they need to be told and has made peace with that. "Mr. Kang made some changes to the schedule," she said. "The west side is covered." "By who?" "By the people covering it, Ava." I let it go. But I thought about it through the afternoon, working through the east wing with the specific focused energy I used when something was bothering me that I couldn't address directly. The schedule change was protective. I understood that without being told, the west rooms were the ones that faced the street, the ones with the clearest sightlines from outside. Someone had decided I shouldn't be visible from the street. Someone had decided that without telling me there was a reason to. I stayed 20 minutes later than usual that evening, finishing a detail I'd been putting off in the upstairs linen closet, and I was coming down the back staircase when I heard voices in the corridor below. I stopped on the landing instinctively, not hiding, just pausing, the way you pause when you're not sure if you're about to walk into something. 2 men, Korean, speaking low and fast, and my Korean was functional at best, but I'd picked up more than I'd expected from months in this house. I caught fragments, a name I didn't recognize, a number that might have been a date, and then a phrase I understood fully because I'd heard it before, in a different context, spoken by Mrs. Park to one of the kitchen staff about an issue with a supplier. He already knows. Silence. Then footsteps moving away. I waited 30 seconds and came down the stairs, and the corridor was empty. I drove home with the radio off, and the city moving past my windows in its usual Friday night way, lit up, indifferent, enormous. And I thought about the car that had been parked outside for 4 days, and the rerouted schedule and the way Seungmin had said it won't happen again, with a certainty that I now understood had not been a reassurance. It had been a consequence. Something had already happened to make it true. I thought about that all the way home. Saturday was my day off. I spent the morning at the farmer's market on Milwaukee Avenue, buying things I didn't strictly need because the ritual of it settled me. The ordinary noise of it. People arguing cheerfully about heirloom tomatoes, and a man playing acoustic guitar near the entrance with his case open, and a small crowd around him doing nothing except listening. I stood near the guitar player for a while and let myself be ordinary. My phone rang at noon. Unknown number, which I didn't usually answer, but something made me. Miss Ava. A woman's voice, accent I couldn't immediately place. I apologize for the intrusion on your day off. I went still in the middle of the market crowd. Who is this? My name isn't important right now. What's important is that you understand something about the situation you're currently in. I'm going to hang up. The man who came to the estate last Thursday, she said. And I didn't hang up. The one they called Marco. He wasn't there to deliver a message to Seungmin. My fingers tightened around the phone. Around me, the market continued. Tomatoes and guitar music and someone's toddler shrieking with delight over a dog. And I stood in the middle of it, absolutely still. He was there to see you, the woman said. To confirm what you look like. A long pause in which I processed this very carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because there are people who believe that the fastest way to reach Seungmin is through something he values. Another pause. You should think about whether you want to remain employed where you are. The line went dead. I stood for a full minute without moving. The guitar player had shifted to something quieter, something in a minor key, and the crowd around him had thinned. I looked at my bag of unnecessary vegetables and felt the specific vertigo of a morning that had been ordinary 3 minutes ago. I drove to the estate. This was against the rhythm of my days off, against the careful line I maintained, against every instinct I had about keeping things separate. But I drove there with a clarity that felt almost physical, like my body had made the decision before my mind caught up. And I parked in the service lot and went inside. Seungmin was in the back garden. This surprised me. I'd never seen him out there before. It was a large and manicured space that existed mainly to be looked at from the windows. He was sitting on the low stone bench near the iron fence at the far end, jacket off, sleeves pushed up, and he was doing nothing, which was the strangest thing I'd ever seen him do. Just sitting, looking at the middle distance, in the way of a person who was either very calm or working very hard at appearing to be. He saw me come through the garden door and didn't look surprised. That registered before anything else, not a micro-expression of surprise quickly contained, just the simple absence of it, as if he'd expected me to come. I walked across the garden to him and stopped a few feet away and said, "Someone called me today." "I know." 2 words, and the bottom dropped out of what I'd thought was solid ground. "You know," I repeated, "I had your number monitored after Marco." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without apology, with the specific quality of a man who had decided that honesty was more efficient than its alternatives. "I should have told you. I didn't, because I didn't want to alarm you before there was a reason." The garden around us was very quiet. The city existed beyond the iron fence, traffic and distance, and the ordinary hum of a Saturday afternoon. But inside the fence it was another kind of air entirely. "And now there's a reason," I said. He looked at me steadily. "Now you know there is. You came to tell me yourself, which means you've already decided something." I thought about that. He was right, which was irritating. I had decided something on the drive over. I just hadn't put language to it yet. "I need to understand what's happening," I said. "Not the version you'd give Mrs. Park, the actual version." A long pause, the kind that had weight to it, that was doing work. "Sit down," he said. I sat down on the bench. Not close to him. There was appropriate distance between us, the kind of distance that could be justified. But on the same bench, in the same garden, on a Saturday afternoon when I didn't need to be here at all. And Seungmin turned toward me slightly and began to talk. Not much. He was constitutionally incapable of excess, in words as in everything else. But he told me enough. The men who'd come to the estate weren't a rival faction in any conventional sense. They were a pressure point, people who trafficked in leverage, who had identified that Seungmin had something adjacent to a vulnerability and were testing its dimensions. They were not, he said, people who acted without calculation. They were also not, he said, people he hadn't been managing for the last 11 days. "And I'm the vulnerability," I said. Not a question. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the garden, at the iron fence, at the middle distance he'd been occupying when I arrived. "You're not a vulnerability," he said finally. "You're a person who works in my house. What they've decided you are is a separate thing." I felt something move through me that I couldn't fully identify, something that was almost anger, and almost something else, something that had no clean name. "That's a very careful distinction," I said. "Yes." "Does it make a practical difference?" He turned and looked at me, and I realized we were closer than I'd accounted for, that the geometry of the bench and the conversation had reduced the appropriate distance somewhere in the last few minutes, without either of us marking it. "That depends," he said quietly, "on what you decide to do." The garden was very still. Above us, the late afternoon light had gone amber, the particular gold of a Chicago October doing its best. And somewhere beyond the iron fence, a car alarm went off and silenced itself, and the world continued. I looked at him and understood, with the specific clarity of a thing you've known for a long time finally surfacing, that this was the actual question. Not the men with their sedans and their phone calls. Not the rerouted schedule or the monitored number or the weight of things I'd been filing away for months. This garden. This bench. This man looking at me like I was the one thing in his line of sight that he hadn't already solved. I didn't answer him that afternoon. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say. I think some part of me had known for a long time, with the particular knowing that lives below articulation, below the clean narratives we build around our choices to make them feel reasonable. I didn't answer because the question felt too large for the garden, too large for the amber light and the iron fence and the careful distance that had quietly disappeared between us. I told him I needed to think. He nodded once, without pressure, without the performance of patience that people do when they're actually waiting for a specific answer. Just a nod, clean and real. And then he looked back at the garden, and I stood up and left. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a long time. The radiator made its noise. The brick wall did its honest thing. I made tea I didn't drink, and I sat with the question, and I let it be complicated, which was the one thing I was usually unwilling to do. I was a person who resolved things, who moved forward, who did not linger in the uncomfortable space between knowing and deciding. I lingered there all of Saturday night. Sunday morning, I woke up and understood something had shifted, the way you understand it. Not through reasoning, but through the specific quality of the light, through the way your body feels in the first seconds before thought arrives. I lay there and took stock of myself honestly. I was afraid. That was real, and it deserved acknowledgement. There were people who had looked at me as an instrument, as a pressure point, as a means to something that had nothing to do with me. And that was frightening in the straightforward way that danger is frightening. I wasn't going to minimize that or fold it into something more romantic. But underneath the fear was something else. Something that had been building for 4 months in the particular grammar of a household, where I'd learned to read silence, to find meaning in small gestures, to understand that a man who said almost nothing was not a man who felt almost nothing. I knew what I was going to do. I think I'd known since I sat down on the bench. Monday I arrived at the estate at my usual time. Mrs. Park was in the kitchen reviewing deliveries. 2 of the newer security staff were doing their morning rotation. Everything had the quality of a normal Monday. The house running its system. Nothing visible on the surface. I did my morning work. I didn't rush it or perform it differently. I moved through the east wing and the main hall with the same attention I always brought, the same care for detail, because the work was the work regardless of everything else. And I'd decided that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to stop being good at my job. At 11, Seungmin came through the main hall. He was on the phone, speaking Korean, low and focused. He saw me from across the hall, and our eyes met for a moment. Just a moment, the kind that might have meant nothing to anyone watching. the ordinary eye contact of a household where employer and employee shared the same space. He ended the call. He didn't cross the hall. He stood at his end of it, and I stood at mine with a furniture polish cloth in my hand, and the morning light coming through the tall windows at a low November angle. Winter arriving early the way it did in Chicago, honest about itself. "You came back," he said. "I work here." A pause. "That's not why you came back." It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even a question exactly. It had the quality of something he was saying out loud that he'd already known, the same way he'd known I was coming on Saturday, the same way he seemed to know most things about me with an accuracy that had stopped unsettling me and started feeling like something else. "No," I said. "It's not." He held my gaze across the length of the hall. The house was quiet around us. The real quiet. The one I'd learned to read. The one that meant everyone else had somehow found other places to be. Which was either coincidence or Seung-min running his household the way he ran everything, with a precision that was invisible until you were inside it. "It's not safe," he said. Straightforward, without apology. "I want you to understand that clearly. It won't always be like last week. It will be different kinds of complicated, and some of them will be worse." "I know." "You're not afraid of complicated." I didn't say that. I said I know. Something happened in his face. That almost nothing shift I'd catalogued for months. The one that cost him something to allow. He crossed the hall. He stopped in front of me. Close. Closer than the professional distance that had governed 4 months of careful navigation. And I stayed where I was because I'd made my decision, and I was done pretending I didn't know what it was. He reached out and took the furniture polish cloth from my hand. Set it on the console table beside us without looking at it. His hands were... I'd noticed this before, couldn't help but notice, the tattoos continuing from his neck, down across his hands. Intricate dark ink against his skin. Very still, very deliberate, every movement chosen. "The people from last week," he said quietly. "They've been handled." I figured. There will be others eventually. There are always others. "I know that too." He looked at me for a long moment. "Then why?" "Because I'm not the same person I was 4 months ago." I said it before I'd finished deciding to, the way true things sometimes come out, without ceremony. And that started before any of this. Before the men in the hallway or Marco or the phone call. It started because I work in your house and you notice things that most people don't notice, and you said my name like it mattered, and I filed all of that away for months because I was being careful. A breath. I'm tired of being careful. The hall was very quiet. Seung-min looked at me with the full weight of his attention, which was, I understood now, the thing people felt when they said his presence changed a room. It wasn't threat, and it wasn't performance. It was the specific quality of someone who was completely, unguardedly present, who had removed the layer of management most people kept up between themselves and the world. And that was its own kind of power, more unsettling in some ways than all the rest of it. He lifted his hand and touched my face. 2 fingers, just beneath my jaw, the barest contact, and I felt it through my entire body like a current finding ground. "You should know," he said very quietly, "that I don't do things halfway. I've noticed that about you. Once you're..." He paused, and it was the first time I'd ever heard him pause in the middle of a sentence, the first crack in the absolute fluency of his self-possession, and it was more intimate than anything else that had happened. Mine. That doesn't change. The word landed on me like something I'd been waiting to hear without knowing I was waiting. I felt it settle into my chest, warm and heavy and irreversible, and I understood that this was the moment, the one I'd been circling for 4 months. Not a dramatic declaration or a grand gesture, but this, a man who almost never said more than was necessary, saying the one word that contained everything. "Okay," I said. His thumb moved slightly against my jaw. A small thing, the smallest possible thing. Okay, he repeated, like he was placing it somewhere permanent. That evening, the city went quiet in the way cities don't actually go quiet. It was still out there, still enormous and indifferent and lit up, the November wind off the lake doing what it always did. But inside the estate, the house had the quality of something settled, something that had moved through its uncertainty and come out the other side into a different kind of stillness. I stayed late. Not because there was work left. There wasn't. I'd finished everything by 6. The house was in order. I stayed because I was learning, slowly, that some lines are only difficult until you cross them, and then they're simply behind you, part of the landscape you've already passed through. Seungmin found me in the library at 8, which was where I'd gone without entirely planning to. A room I'd always loved in the house, floor-to-ceiling shelves and the particular smell of old paper, and a window seat that looked out over the garden. He sat across from me and said nothing. I said nothing. The city existed beyond the glass in its ordinary way. At some point, he picked up the book I'd left on the side table, a worn paperback I'd brought from home, nothing impressive, and looked at the cover and set it back down. A small, domestic gesture, in a life that had very few of them, I understood. A man who operated in silences and consequences, and careful words, picking up a paperback and setting it down because it was there, and I was there, and the evening was doing its quiet thing. I thought about who I'd been when I walked through the service entrance 4 months ago. Practical, self-contained, building a bridge to a future I hadn't defined. I thought about the specific series of small moments that had, without any single one of them being decisive, added up to this room and this evening and this man, across from me who I had decided to stop being careful about. I wasn't the same person. He'd known that before I said it. He'd probably known it before I did. Outside, the city moved through its November night, enormous and unsentimental. Inside, the library held its warmth and its silence, and Seungmin sat in the chair across from me with the stillness that had once made every room feel like the edge of something unnamed. It still felt like an edge. I just stopped being afraid of edges. That felt, in the end, like enough.